Hi again, Dr. Mashburn. So today we're going to start talking about the heart. So we're going to introduce the topic of heart and cardiology. And so, sorry, sometimes just doesn't work. Okay. So the heart is the central part of the cardiovascular system. We've talked about the cardiovascular system being a system of a pump with some vessels or pump and tubes. So you have your heart and you have these tubes. And so if you think the heart is an actual organ that pumps, it pumps blood through the arteries, then the arterial blood is going to go to capillaries and then return to the heart via the veins. And so the heart is the actual pump that does this. And it's really two pumps, and it's two side-by-side pumps. You have a right side pump and a left side pump. And the right side, so I'm going to draw a little cross like this. So this is going to be the right side, and this is the left side. The right side receives oxygen-poor blood. So this is blood returning from the body. So it's gone out and it's delivered as oxygen, picked up CO2, and it's going to bring that deoxygenated blood to the right side. And then it's going to send that blood to the lungs to get rid of that CO2 and pick up oxygen via the pulmonary circuit. Okay, so the right side pumps to the pulmonary circuit. The left side receives oxygenated blood from the lungs. Okay, so you've picked up your O2, and it's going to pump that blood to the body via the systemic circuit. Okay, so blood's going to come in the right side, then it's going to go out to the lungs, then it's going to return from the lungs to the left side, and then go out to the body. So the way this happens is you have to have, actually it's more like almost four pumps. So let's draw, I like to draw a little cross so you can see your right versus left. And so there's actually four separate chambers that make up the heart. So on the right side you have two chambers, and on the left side you have two chambers. So at the top of the heart you have the atria. Okay, so this is your right atrium, and this is your left atrium. So that's two chambers, left and right atria. And at the bottom you have your ventricles. So this is the large chamber, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And so your four separate chambers, the atria, the two on the top, they receive blood. So the right atrium receives blood from the body, that venous blood from the body, and the left atrium receives venous blood from the lungs. Okay? The right ventricle sends via an artery blood to the lungs, and the left ventricle sends blood to the body. Okay, so four chambers. Two superior chambers, the atria, are receiving blood, and the two inferior ventricles are ejecting or delivering blood. So they do this through two separate circuits, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. And the pulmonary circuit is the one that goes out to the lungs, where you exchange oxygen and CO2 in the lungs, so give off CO2, receive oxygen. The systemic circuit is where you take oxygen to the body and receive the CO2. Okay, so the colors, red means it's oxygenated and blue means it's deoxygenated, it's oxygen poor. So remember, your receiving chambers are the atria. Okay, so the right atrium is receiving blood from the systemic circuit, the left atrium is receiving blood from the pulmonary circuit. Your pumping chambers are the ventricles. The right one is pumping blood to the lungs through the pulmonary circuit, the left ventricle to the body through the systemic circuit. Okay, so if you were to imagine a drop of blood, and so hopefully you've learned a little bit about your vessels. So remember, blood can go out to the body through the arteries and then come back through the veins. So let's say blood is coming back, returning to the heart, to the vena cava, that large vein that brings blood back to the heart. So we're going to just start it right here. So blood's returning, it's deoxygenated, goes into the right atrium to the right ventricle. Okay, now it leaves the right ventricle and it enters into the pulmonary circuit, okay, where it goes out to the lungs, drops off the CO2, picks up the oxygen. Now this is an artery, even though it's blue, it's going away from the heart, it's taking blood to the lungs. You're going to pick up your oxygen, return to the heart, so this is a vein, to the left atrium. This is oxygenated blood going into the left atrium. It's going to go to the left ventricle, okay? the left ventricle will then pump it to the aorta, which is we know is a large artery, and then it will go out to the systemic circuit. So you have two separate circuits that are kind of connected by the heart. All right, so blood is going to go, it's one continuous loop from the right atrium to the right ventricle, out to the lungs, back to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, out to the body. So just one long continuous loop that's broken up into two circuits, one to the lungs and one to the systemic or to the body. All right, so where is the heart? It's about the size of your fist. So if you take your fist and kind of hold it over your chest, it's a little bit to the left. So if you think about your heart lies a little bit to the left side of your chest, pretty much in the middle. It is just above your diaphragm in the thoracic cavity. And if you were to draw a midline sagittal kind of section, you'll see that most of the heart is off to the left a little bit. It's not an organ that's very symmetrical, and it has a kind of a pointy end. So I'm going to draw an old-fashioned heart. The pointy end is called the apex. Okay, so this is the apex, and then the end has all the vessels coming out of it. That's the base. Okay, so think about a pyramid where the pointy end is the apex, okay, and then the flat end is the base. So put your heart just upside down in your body. The pointy end is the apex. So don't think of apex being the top, just think of apex being the pointy end. All right, and so you want to know where your apex is, because this is where you can actually feel your heartbeat, what's called the apical impulse. If you take your fingers and go just below your left nipple, between the 5th and 6th ribs, you should be able to feel kind of the strongest heartbeat. So if you're trying to feel your heartbeat and you're like, I can't feel my heartbeat, kind of go more to the left, below the left nipple, and between your 5th and 6th ribs, and you should be able to feel your heart. If you remember, so the heart lies in the thoracic cavity. And so the thoracic cavity was made up of 4 smaller cavities. You had the mediastinum, and then the pericardial cavity, okay, containing the heart. Then each lung was in its own pleural cavity. So you remember that? So the heart's in the pericardial cavity, the lungs are in the pleural cavity. And again, the heart lies just a little bit to the left. And so the apex of the heart kind of cuts into the left lung. We want to talk about the pericardial sac. So if you remember, we talked about this in our first anatomy semester, that we have membranes. And so remember, membranes line cavities, and all of these serous membranes have 2 layers. There's a parietal layer, which lines the cavity, and there's a visceral layer that actually lines the actual organ. And then between those 2 membranes, you have the cavity with the serous fluid. Is that ringing a bell? I hope so. If not, you need to go back and look at that. So the heart is no different. You have a pericardial sac, okay? So a double wall sac encloses the heart, and it has a special fibrous pericardium that's kind of the most superficial layer. And so you have this real nice fibrous pericardium kind of surrounding the heart, and it helps protect the heart. It's real durable. It anchors the heart, and it also prevents the heart from overfilling. So it kind of holds the heart in and prevents it from overfilling and possibly, I guess, exploding. So that's the fibrous pericardium. Just deep to that, see that visceral and parietal pericardial sac that we talked about earlier in our first anatomies. So you have the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. You have the visceral layer of the pericardium, and in between you have the pericardial cavity, and that's where the serous fluid is. Now, the visceral layer is also called the epicardium. Okay, so we've been using visceral pericardium a lot before in earlier anatomy. Now we're going to change the name and call it the epicardium. All right, just below the epicardium you have a layer of muscle. So myo means muscle. This is the myocardium. This is the cardiac muscle that's actually contracting and causing the heart to beat and move the blood. Just deep to that you have the endocardium. And the endocardium is made up of the same thing. It's continuous with the endothelial lining of the blood vessels. Okay, so it's the same tissue. So you have the next layer would be the actual inside of the heart, which is where the blood would be. All right, so you have the blood, then you have an endocardium, then a myocardium, then an epicardium, then you have a parietal layer of the serous membrane, and then a fibrous pericardium. All right, so that could be an all that apply question or an ordering question, and certainly it'll be on your anatomy, so you'll see this again when we do the anatomy part of the heart. When we talk about most anatomy and physiology, we like to give you a couple of homeostatic imbalances or disorders. So pericarditis is an inflammation of the pericardium. And so remember that serous fluid is meant to allow the heart to beat without creating friction. And so if there's an inflammation of the pericardium, then there's going to be some friction. So there's the membranes are rough, and you get a pericardial friction rub. So if you listen to that with a stethoscope, you hear a creaking sound. Okay, so you can actually hear that. Another disorder can be cardiac tamponade, and this is when there's actually fluid buildup around in the pericardial sac around the heart, and so now there's so much fluid around the heart actually has a hard time beating. There's basically pressure being pushed back on the heart, so it's kind of like your heart's beating in a water balloon, and so it limits its pumping ability. So both of those are kind of disorders associated with that pericardial sac. When we talk about cardiac muscle, we talked about the different muscle types in our first anatomy, and we talked about skeletal muscle. And if you'll remember, skeletal muscle are going to be long, continuous muscle cells, muscle fibers that have an origin and an insertion, and they contract as a unit, okay? And they contract in one direction. So if you have your biceps brachii, it connects up here, and it contracts in one direction, pulling and not pushing, remember, so pulling and not pushing. Cardiac muscle is a little different. It's arranged in a circular bundles and also a spiral arrangement. And so this allows for pumping of the blood. And so instead of this flexion and extension type of thing that you think of with skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle kind of works together to pump the blood. And so let me draw my little cross again. We talked about how the blood is going to come into the atria, the left and right side, and as the blood comes into the atria, it will then fall into the ventricles. And then the atria will contract just a little bit to push the rest of the blood and make sure they're completely empty and the ventricles are full. And so that's what these muscles do. They're kind of squeeze together and kind of force that blood down into the ventricles. This part of the muscle, as you can see, it's kind of a spiral shaped. It allows the heart to pump kind of in and up, so it kind of does like that, all right? Because the blood to go out to the lungs and out to the body, those vessels are at the top. They're at the base, and so the blood has got to come up and out, all right? Does that make sense? It's got to go up to the lungs and up to the aorta. And so having this spiral arrangement of the muscle allows it to kind of almost like twist and contract as it moves up. I'll try to find a video so that you guys can see that. If I can't find one, I'm sure there's one out there, but you can surely Google one, but I'll try to find you one that shows how the heart is kind of pumping that blood up and out. But that's based on form follows function. We need to pump that blood up and out so the muscles have a spiral arrangement. Cardiac muscles are involuntary. We talked about how you have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, so it's involuntary muscle. It's striated just like skeletal muscle. It's got those little stripes, those sarcomeres. But instead of being long, continuous muscle cells, they're going to be short and branched. Okay, so they're short and branched. And so here you can see one. Here's one that branches off, and here's one that branches off and branches off. And so look back at that picture. By having branching, you have a muscle that can be in a circular arrangement. Okay, so they're not these long parallel cells. Because they're branched, they can go around a round object. So that again, form follows function. They usually have one or two nuclei. Okay, and they have a lot of mitochondria. So what do mitochondria do? Make ATP. And your heart never stops beating. Okay, it's beating all the time, so it uses a tremendous amount of ATP. So about 25 to 35% of the volume of the cell is mitochondria. There's also some specialized connections between cardiac cells that allow them to all beat at the same time, so that your heart will beat as a nice unit. You have what are called desmosomes, and these prevent the cells from separating. So they kind of hold the cardiac cells together so they don't split apart. But then you have gap junctions. These are gap junctions, and they look like channels, right? And so they actually allow ions to pass from cell to cell and electrically couple these cells. So if you think back to muscle cell contraction, where we had that whole series of events where sodium and potassium were moving, you had depolarization, repolarization, and ions were moving in order for the skeletal muscle to contract. Well, these gap junctions allow that electricity to kind of pass quicker, and allows the muscle to beat as what's called a functional syncytium, which basically means together. And so it beats as a single coordinated unit. And that's pretty cool. So again, form follows function. When we think about the heart, we also want to talk about the heart valves. Again, you'll see this again in your lab portion. But these valves ensure that blood only flows in one direction. So you have unidirectional blood flow. And they open and close. They don't use ATP. They're not actively being opened and closed. There's no muscle contraction going on. They open and close based on changes in pressure. So as blood's pushing against them, that causes them to open up. All right, so the four, and I'll show that in more detail. Hang on. The four valves are your pulmonary valve, your aortic valve, your mitral valve, which is also called your bicuspid, and your tricuspid. All right, so you have your pulmonary valve, your aortic valve, your mitral valve, and your tricuspid valve. When you're looking at that, the mitral or bicuspid, these are also called atrioventricular valves, okay, and the tricuspid, these are atrioventricular valves. So what that means, atrioventricular, these are the valves, okay, so here and here, that are between the atria and the ventricles, so atrioventricular. So these are the valves that allow blood to go from the atrium to the ventricle and then not regurgitate and go backwards back up into the atrium, the AV valves. So we'll use that term for short, the AV valves. The aortic and pulmonary valves, the aortic valve is when the blood's leaving the left ventricle going through the aorta. There's a valve here that closes at the base of the aorta so that blood doesn't fall back into the ventricle. And then there's a pulmonary valve so that when blood is leaving the right ventricle and going out to the lungs, it doesn't fall back into the right ventricle. That valve will close. So those are your valves. So we're going to give you a little more detail about how they work. So the AV valves, the atrioventricular valves, prevent backflow of blood into the atria when the ventricles are contracting. Okay? So you have a tricuspid valve, which is your right AV valve. You have a mitral valve, also called the bicuspid valve, which is your left AV valve. And you have two structures that are associated with these valves called the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles. And these help hold those flaps in a closed position. So they're going to kind of anchor those valves and keep them closed and prevent the blood from regurgitating back up into the atrium. So this is what this looks like. So here are your actual valves, okay? And so these little, these are the heartstrings. You may have heard, if you like Harry Potter and they have dragon heartstrings, those are actually the little chordae tendineae. And they attach to papillary muscles. And so think of these as almost like parachute cords that kind of hold those valves in place. So when blood is returning to the heart, okay, so it's coming from the vena cava, it's coming into the right atrium, all right, as that blood is filling up the atrium, it's exerting weight and pressure, that's going to open up that, it's going to push against the door, push the valve open, and the blood will fall into the ventricle, all right, so that blood's going to fall into the ventricle. Now, when the ventricle contracts, remember it's going to contract in that kind of up and out pattern, and as it's pushing that blood up and out, it's going to push back up against that AV valve. Well, as it's pushing against that AV valve, it causes them to close. And so now those chordae tendineae and papillary muscles prevent those valves from regurgitating and opening back up into the atrium. Okay? So that's the way the AV valves work. Same thing on the left side. So blood falls into the left atrium. It's going to fall into the left ventricle. And then as the left ventricle contracts, it's going to push that blood up and out the aorta. And again, it's going to push it against that AV valve and cause it to remain closed. Okay, so that's how the AV valves work. So remember, you have your tricuspid and your bicuspid. So which one's which? Tricuspid on the right side, bicuspid or mitral on the left side. So if someone has mitral valve prolapse, that means their left AV valve is prolapsing and kind of going up into the atria, and blood is regurgitating back into the atria. Okay, so that makes a less efficient heart contraction, less efficient blood pumping if you have mitral valve prolapse. And you can also hear it, so it's called a heart murmur, and you can hear the blood kind of go backwards into the atrium. All right, so the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve are called semilunar valves because they kind of look like little half moons. So they're called the SL or semilunar valves. So you have the aortic semilunar valve and the pulmonary semilunar valve. And a lot of times I'll just abbreviate that as SLV and pulmonary SLV, pulmonary semilunar valve. And so these semilunar valves, they prevent backflow into the ventricles. So the AV valves prevent backflow into the atria, and the semilunar valves prevent backflow into the ventricles. And so when the ventricles, when they contract, well, then they relax, the blood wants to fall back from the pulmonary circuit and from the aorta. They want to fall back into the ventricles, but you don't want that to happen. You need that blood to keep moving forward. And so this pulmonary semilunar valve and aortic valve will close to prevent backflow of blood into the ventricle. So what does that look like? All right, so the blood has been in the ventricles, and now we have contracted the heart. So the heart has undergone contraction, and now it's relaxing. So when the heart relaxes, okay, so the blood was pushed out through the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So you have your aortic semilunar valve and your pulmonary semilunar valves right here. So here's a pulmonary semilunar valve, and the aortic is right there. So as the heart relaxes, it opens back up. Okay, so it's contracted, now it's relaxed. And so what you would expect is that blood would just want to fall right back into the ventricles. Well, as it starts to fall, it fills up these little cusps, okay, and that causes those valves to click shut, all right? So as the ventricles relax and the intraventricular pressure falls, the blood falls back from the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. It fills those cusps and causes them to shut like little trapdoors. And so one of the things we're going to talk about heart sounds is you can actually hear these valves, as they're closing. So that's what you're listening with. As heart sounds, you're listening for the snapping shut of these valves. And a murmur, you'll hear shushing sounds. So if there's a prolapse or an incompetent valve, you'll hear that blood kind of going the wrong way as a kind of a shushing sound. So problems with valves, you can have incompetent valves, and that means that if it doesn't work, if it remains open, or if it prolapses and opens up the wrong direction and allows blood to go back into the ventricle, your heart's just going to keep repumping that same blood over and over and over again. Okay, so that makes it very, very inefficient. So you get backflow of blood, and you're just kind of pumping the same blood over again, and you can have problems with oxygenation. You can have valvular stenosis, and that means it's too stiff. That's a stiff valve, and so that means the valve doesn't open as easily as it should, and so the heart has to contract even harder to pop it open, which means the heart has to work harder, and so that can cause the heart to work hard and can cause heart damage. So whenever you have incompetent valves or stenotic valves, you can replace them either with a mechanical valve or like a pig valve, like an animal valve, or even a human cadaver valve, because you don't want the heart to be pumping inefficiently. So valve replacements are commonly done with people with some kind of valve problem. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is called the coronary circulation. And the coronary circulation, we've talked about arteries and veins, and you should have learned about all of your different blood vessels when you were talking about blood and blood vessels. And so if you look at the heart, we're going to do heart anatomy in your lab, but you have your aorta here, and then you've got your vena cava, and you've got your pulmonary arteries, and you've got your pulmonary veins. Okay, so these are the large vessels that are taking blood to and from the pulmonary circuit and to and from the systemic circuit. Well, those don't actually nourish the heart themselves, and the heart itself is a muscle, and it needs its own blood. And so coronary circulation is the actual arteries and veins that take blood to and from the heart muscle itself. Okay, and this happens when the heart is relaxed. So the heart contracts, and then when it relaxes, it allows those vessels kind of open up, and blood will actually travel down these arteries and veins to the heart muscle itself. And so the left ventricle, because it's the bigger side, it's got the bigger muscle, because you need a bigger muscle on the left side to pump blood all the way out to the rest of the body. It receives most of the blood supply. The arterial supply varies among individuals, but in lab we're going to kind of give you the main arterial supply that you need to be looking for, kind of 4 or 5 main coronary arteries to learn about. You'll also learn about some coronary veins. Some of the cool things about coronary arteries and veins is they have anastomosis, so they'll actually kind of join each other. And so this allows there to be multiple routes of blood delivery to the heart, because you really don't want the heart to not be nourished, because if you did, you would have what's called a heart attack. And so the heart tries as hard as it can to provide as many routes as it can for nourishment. But again, obviously we know heart attacks exist, and so we can't always compensate for coronary artery occlusion, but our heart does at least try to do that. And so some of those problems that we associate with coronary arteries is angina pectoris, and this kind of chest pain. So thoracic pain, and it's fleeting. It doesn't last long, but it's maybe by a small reduction in blood delivery to the myocardium. And it may not kill the cells, but they may become weakened. So angina is a warning sign. If you've got angina, that's a warning sign of possibly an impending heart attack. So you'll want to get that treated. Find out if there's a blockage that's trying to become totally occluded or not. So a heart attack is actually called a myocardial infarction, or an MI. And that is a prolonged coronary artery blockage. So the coronary artery is blocked, blood supply can't get to the muscle dies, and so you have weakened contractile ability of the heart. And so when we do the heart lab, we'll show you the heart, we'll show you some of the main coronary arteries and the ones that supply the major parts of the muscle, and we'll tell you which ones are more likely to be more fatal than others. All right, so that's all I'm going to talk about today, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks a lot.